Okay.
It's good to hear your voice and good that you are still out there doing what you do, because Americans, we are often surprised by polls. Tell us, going back, how long have you been doing this?
Well, I began polling full-time for my career in 1994, which means almost 20 years, and I actually did my first couple of polls back in the 80s when it was not yet a full-time profession.
So are you sometimes surprised by the results of your own polls?
Oh, of course. Sometimes the surprises are in the big numbers. Sometimes the surprises are in the details along the way. But if you don't have the curiosity to be asking about new questions and different things, you shouldn't be in the business.
And so as you've watched the polls over the last just about 20 years, what is the most overall surprising trend to you?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think the thing that I talk about the most in my work that is a surprise to people I talk to, rather than necessarily a surprise to me, is consistently, repeatedly, the American people are the solution to our problems. They have good common sense wisdom, and they're far more willing to make hard choices than political leaders. And that's just, I say that time and time again, and especially in Washington, they say, you've got to be kidding.
Yeah. And I do see that all the time. I'll see your polls come out and I'll talk about them on my show. And a lot of times those polls really don't surprise me, because I feel like I'm kind of mainstream. I'm kind of a center right conservative type who believes in God and country and the American way and the flag and whatever. And a lot of times I see that reflected in your polls, that's what most Americans believe. But the disconnect between Washington, D.C. and what just the common guy out there is experiencing in his daily life and his opinion about that is sometimes astonishing to me. What, at this moment, Scott, what is the largest disconnect between your polls' opinions and those you've polled and their opinions, and the folks in Washington, D.C.? What are they just not catching on to in Washington, D.C. at this moment?
Well, on one issue, it is consistently on spending and fiscal policy issues. The American people are willing to support major reforms as long as they're thoughtful, that will reduce spending, and people in Washington don't want to see anything cut. We saw that with the sequester battle. Right now, 35% of Americans say the country is heading in the right direction. That doesn't sound great, but it's up 7 points since the sequester went through. And people in Washington said when that went through, everything would be a problem.
Right.
A different issue where there's a big gap right now was immigration. On that, most Americans do want to see some kind of comprehensive reform that lets people who cross the border illegally but otherwise became a productive resident stay in this country. But they want to do that only if the border is secured first. In Washington, they ignore that part of it. And what amazes me is they don't seem to understand that nobody trusts them. Only 9% of voters think the federal government is going to try to enforce the border if some kind of reform is passed.
It's funny. I just talked about that exact topic on Cavuto, I think on Monday or Tuesday, and I can't believe that I'm not even seeing Republicans fighting for securing the borders, because you do, in your polling, I see all the time, that is a primary concern among people on the right and the left of this topic, correct?
That's correct. And again, I think you got to be careful with it. Sometimes people on the right sound hateful towards immigrants.
Right.
Nobody's mad at immigrants. They understand why you'd want to bring your family here. They understand why you'd want to seek out different opportunities. But they are mad at a system that doesn't even try to enforce the border. In fact, half of Americans think that federal policies encourage more illegal immigration. They'd rather see us perhaps going after the employers who knowingly hire illegal immigrants, those sorts of things. And the other big part of the story that Republicans, especially, and conservatives, are bad at talking about, 2 out of 3 Americans do say that when it's done legally, immigration is good for America. This is seen as a positive thing. So yes, we do have a problem with the borders. We do have to figure out how to deal with that, but that doesn't mean people want to close down the borders and keep immigrants out.
All right. One other topic that has been obviously very paramount in our news, I've been doing a lot of talking about it as well, is, of course, the whole issue of Sandy Hook and gun control. What were the trends you saw immediately before, immediately after, and now regarding gun control in Sandy Hook?
Well, before the Sandy Hook disaster, about 40% of Americans thought we needed stricter gun control laws. That's up about 10 points since the disaster. It's held fairly steady since then. I would expect it will be starting to decline in the next few months. But the storyline that we keep hearing is that there's this massive public call for something to be done. And look, people do want something done. That was a horrible event. Nobody wants to even think of having to go through something like that. But they don't see any of the solutions coming out of Washington as necessarily the right thing. For example, most Americans do support the idea of background checks, but most also say they will not reduce violence in America. They want them very limited, only to severe mental health problems or convicted felons. They don't want any kind of a registry kept. So there is a sense that the public is open to some very minor reforms, but they're not looking for, the mood has not changed dramatically the way people in Washington expected it would.
Now, we all know that President Obama was, of course, reelected. What is happening with his popularity among the average Joe out there? And especially, can you kind of, one of the things you can't do in just one poll is, can you kind of parallel that with what is happening economically and especially to jobs? Is that related to his popularity, or is he really just isolated from that, insulated?
Well, it's certainly the overall economic situation plays a role for any president. It's the most important issue out there. President Obama's job approval rating this morning in our poll is at 50%. For most of his first 3 years in office, he was at 47%. His numbers right now are trending down a little bit, and it wouldn't surprise me if by the end of this year he gets back to where he was for most of his first term. The economy has actually, been, at least consumer confidence has been improving over the last 3 months. And that has not been helping the president. So it's a little unclear as to what's going on with the connection there at this point in time. And what about predictions? You've been doing this polling for 20 years. I don't know if you're willing or not, but I'd love to hear what you think. You just made, I guess, one prediction, but I'd love to hear what you think is going to happen over the next year and certainly over the rest of Obama's term. It'd be interesting to hear just what your thoughts are, having watched these political cycles over and over again from a statistical standpoint. Well, there's a couple of things that I think are going to happen. One is frustration is going to continue to grow. Neither political party is talking in ways that make sense. They're talking about settling debating points rather than trying to solve problems. And Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals. I describe it sometimes like listening to a cell phone conversation. Somebody sitting next to you, you don't know them. It's really annoying to listen to half the conversation. Well, the politicians are talking only about the role of government rather than how to solve problems. And most Americans know there's a lot more to solving problems than just the public policy thing. So I think the frustration will increase. I think the second big story will be the president's health care law, whether it survives technically or not, is going to emerge much differently than anybody anticipated. The story I give, back in 1978, a benefits consultant found this provision in the IRS code called 401ks. It was never intended to create the retirement programs that it did, but he read the proposal, found it, and now 50 million people have 401ks.
Right.
I believe I know people are looking at the healthcare law, all those 2,000 pages, and they are going to find ways for people to have more choices than the president intended, and that will undo most of what the president's law was intended to accomplish.
Wow, interesting. I've not heard that anywhere else, Scott. That's really interesting. One last question for you. I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to tap this brain of yours. When I read some of your statistics that you're polling, and I think, where does he find the people? I went on Wife Swap. I don't know if you knew that or not, but there was kind of and the people out there who don't understand. Yeah, I went on the show Wife Swap. Sorry, and the people out there that don't understand the most fundamental aspects of politics astonish me. And it's most people, because they're watching reality TV, they're watching MTV. They're not reading Scott Rasmussen's polls. They're not listening to the Dr. Gina show, and they're not tuned into a lot of things. So when I see statistics like Here's one. 66% oppose Cyprus bailout plan to tax bank deposits. I just know you had to call 1,000 people to get one person that even knew what the heck you were talking about. Is that true?
There's a couple of issues in there. Number one, if you ask about a specific thing like that, you have to give them a little bit of background information, which can obviously impact any of the results. An issue like Cyprus, basically people know that something's going on in Europe. There's a lot of bailouts. And when they hear that somebody is taxing bank accounts, they don't like it. They're afraid the government here will try it, and they're unhappy with it. So if you interpret that to mean that people sit around and study the Cyprus plan and this is their considered thought, no, that's not the case. If you consider it as a gut reaction to what's happening, yes, it's good. And that's I think what you have to do with a lot of this. Most Americans pay attention to things that matter to them and that they can have some impact on. Most Americans, for example, don't know who their member of Congress is, but that's because they don't have any options. There's no reason for them to know who their member of Congress is. If they need help with something, they can Google them and find out from their constituent services person whatever help they need. But those are the sorts of details that don't matter. What I think is really interesting, people's instincts are sound, and if we give them reasonable choices to make, they come up with reasonable decisions.
Well, Scott Rasmussen, you remain the prince of polls, and we sure do appreciate all the hard work that you do, keeping us informed of what is trending for those who are in the know. So thank you so much, Scott, for being with us today on the Dr. Gina Show.
Thank you. Can't wait to see you again soon.
All right, my friend, you take care now. Coming up next, we are